Well, I'm just honored and excited to be here with these two wonderful authors who've done some amazing work in exposing a history that is largely, maybe people think they know, but they really don't know the details of. I'll start with you, Rachel. In your book, A Most Tolerant Little Town, I love that title, you talk about the desegregation of Clinton High School in Clinton, Tennessee. And as was mentioned, this was 2 years after Brown versus Board of Education, but a year before Little Rock, which is the touchstone that everybody remembers with school desegregation. Tell us a little bit about how you got interested in the story.
For me, this story actually started as a work assignment. I took a year off between my MA and my PhD, and I'm an oral historian by training. So I got sent out to all these tiny little towns around the Mid-South, the Southeast, and my job was to go in, spend, half a week, interviewing as many people as I could. Then I would transcribe the interviews, send them back, and the town would use it to do a National Historic Register nomination. Or in the case of Clinton, they were going to be opening a museum. They had all sorts of different projects for it. And when I got to Clinton, there were really two events that happened. The one that I talk about in the book was there was a white teacher in town who had been made the unofficial guidance counselor for the Black students. Her name was Margaret Anderson. When desegregation happened, she was just like all of the other white people in town. She didn't believe in it, but she did believe in law and order. However, through her interactions with the Black students, she became one of the only true integrationists in town. And she ended up writing about the difference between desegregation and integration for the New York Times. She wrote an entire book called The Children of the South, talking about how much pressure, how much the cost of changing America falls on our children instead of on the adults in the room, and really calling out white leaders for that. And when I was introduced to her, the person who introduced me said, "Now, remember, Miss Anderson, you lied in your book. You tell Rachel what we agreed had occurred." And I said, "What in the world is happening in this little town that you could tell your teacher what she is allowed to say?" And then just as I got to know more and more about that location and about the critical moment this was in American history, as I started to wrestle with the cost of us forgetting about it, Clinton, it's extremely violent. There are massive riots in the town. The Tennessee governor, though, sends in the National Guard to enforce the court order instead of to prevent it, which is the reason that Orval Faubus makes exactly the opposite choice a year later. The school was bombed and destroyed and rebuilt by an international fundraising campaign headed up by the evangelist Billy Graham. It's a massive story. When it happens, throughout it all, the school never closes and it never resegregates. The day after the bombing, they hold classes outside in the schoolyard. And so while it is a very violent story, it is also to some degree a story of success. It's a story of students and teachers who make a change. And there is a cost when we start with a story of failure instead.
And Jerry, I know you've told this story many, many times, but tell us what started you on the track.
Well, two events real quickly. One is I was assigned as a young reporter for the Clarion Ledger, which is the statewide newspaper in Mississippi, to go cover the press premiere of a new movie called Mississippi Burning. And I happened to go to the movie where also were two FBI agents who investigated the case, as well as a journalist who covered it, Bill Miner. And so we ended up, after the movie was over, I was shocked. Like, I knew none of this history. I grew up in East Texas and moved to Mississippi for the job. And so this was all very shocking. I mean, this is January of '89. And the fact that more than 20 Klansmen had gotten away with basically a triple murder and nobody ever been prosecuted for murder, that was the thing that really stuck with me. I was just like, what? How does this happen? I cover trials all the time. How does, murder trials, like how does this, 20 Klansmen get away with killing, these 3 young men like that. And then about a month later, I don't know if you're like me, but if someone tells me I can't have something, I want it like a million times worse. Anybody else like that? And so there was something in Mississippi called the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, which was this state segregationist spy agency, spied on more than 10,000 people, including Elvis Presley, the notorious civil rights agitator, right? And of course Fannie Lou Hamer and so many others who really did really, but they had more than 186,000 pages of files. And so it existed from the 1950s into the 1970s, when the Mississippi legislature voted to basically disband the commission and seal all those files for 50 years. So my first thought when I heard that was, there's got to be something in there, I know the legislature, they're not sealing these files because, they're trying to cover something up. So I began to develop sources who had access to files, began to leak me the files. And what they showed was the same time the state of Mississippi was prosecuting the killer of Medgar Evers, Byron D. LeBeck, with this other arm of the state, the Sovereignty Commission, which was secretly assisting in defense, trying to get Beckwith acquitted, and nobody knew that. So that story ran October 1st of '89, and that case got reopened. It's a long story, but that's kind of how my journey began. Yeah.
Something that both of you do so well is to describe the culture of fear and intimidation during those times, especially, in schools with, these young kids, even intimidating each other, the kids that are integrating the school, and the courage of a few people to stand up, like the mothers who wanted their children to get the best education, like people like Vernon Damer. Talk about the intimidation and what it took for people to stand up to that.
Yeah, within Clinton High School, the intimidation in the beginning, it's just sort of ad hoc is not quite the right word, but improvisation. They know how to be bullies, they're bullies. But by October of that year, when the Black students are still in the classroom, a group of white girls organize what they chartered an official organization with the state called the Tennessee White Youth. And the purpose of the Tennessee White Youth was that the young women would release press statements and talk to the adults and all the reporters in town about how dangerous it was that they were in classrooms with these Black boys. We are only a couple of years after Emmett Till. This is terrifying language. These kids are the same age as Emmett Till. They know what happens to Black teenagers when white women talk this way. So the girls start doing that, and then the white boys begin intentional terror campaigns against the Black students and anyone who even makes eye contact with them. Like, the level of social isolation that the Black students go through that year is overwhelming. But this group of white kids makes it so that you can't lend a pencil to the kid sitting at the desk next to yours. You can't lend a piece of paper to them. You can't say, hey, cute outfit today. Nothing. And at the same time they're doing that, their parents are organizing a terror campaign against the Black neighborhood in Clinton, Tennessee. It's in Anderson County. And so not only is the Klan riding through, it's called the Hill, not only is the Klan riding through the Hill as well as the White Citizens Council, but there is a bombing campaign that takes place. This is coal country. They have dynamite. And so there are multiple explosions that take place. There are drive-by shootings where unmarked cars pull up outside the home of one of the teenagers and fire through the windows. And it doesn't stop in 1956. It continues for years afterwards.
Yeah, I love your phrase, how you put it. It's how apathy enables hatefulness and how discord can balloon into violence. And certainly, Jerry, that violence was very, very, very apparent in Mississippi.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was just horrific. I mean, the summer of '64, for example, I think there were 70 or 80 church bombings alone, and of course the Klan was responsible for killing of at least dozens of Black Americans and those who dared to stand up. And so that went on obviously for many years, from the 50s into even the 70s. So
talk about Vernon Dahmer and who he was.
Oh yeah, happy to. Vernon Dahmer, which most people, unless you're, maybe if you're in Mississippi, but if you're not in Mississippi, you wouldn't necessarily have heard of Vernon Dahmer. Vernon Dahmer, he and his family lived in the Hattiesburg, Mississippi area, and he was totally dedicated to voting rights, and the Klan didn't like that. And so on January 10th, 1966, which is after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, Klan attacked him and his family in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, set their house on fire, began firing their guns into the house. Vernon Dahmer woke up, grabbed his shotgun, ran in front of the house, began firing back at the Klansmen so his family could escape safely out a back window. Unfortunately, the flames of the fire seared his lungs, and he died the next day. A few weeks later, in the mail came his voter registration card. He had fought his whole life for the right of all Americans to be able to vote, but never been able to cast a ballot himself. And incredibly courageous man and courageous family. And of course, they had a few trials back in the 60s, but after, it was like a handful of convictions, but it was kind of a joke after that. The governor would pardon them, like one of them got convicted of arson and he got pardoned. Another one got a life sentence and got released on work release, all those kind of things. So it's just horrific, all these things that happened and that went unpunished. Essentially the guy that ordered the killing, Sam Bowers, just essentially got away with it.
I love both of you put the victims and their families and the people struggling against these systems at the center of your stories. And I think, that is just so much of what brings you into the story. You're both great storytellers, but you really get the feeling of what it was like through the eyes of those students who had to walk down the hill to the school. You really get the feeling of what it was like for Myrlie Evers. So tell me a little bit, was that something you did consciously? Tell me a little bit about why it was so important to center the story around the victims and their families.
Oh, okay. Turn to me.
We'll alternate. You go first this time.
Okay. No, it's incredibly important. I just mentioned about Vernon Dahmer. I'll tell that one since I already told that much of it. So Vernon Dahmer's oldest son is Vernon Dahmer Jr., and he was in the Air Force at the time. 4 of his sons were in the military time. In fact, if you ever go to the Civil Rights Museum in Mississippi, in Jackson, that photograph is up on the wall. It's incredibly powerful of the 4 sons of Vernon Dahmer standing over the rubble of that home. And but 6 of his 7 sons served a total of 78 years in our armed forces. And so Vernon Jr. told me, when he came back, he had to, he had to kind of be in charge, because, this is not just wiped out, not just killed his dad, but, the breadwinner, in many ways for the family. And so had to find a place for the family to live, had to find, like all these things. And he told me there was no time to cry. And, but just to get to know that family, everybody who's met the Vernon Dahmer family, I always say this, if we just had more families like the Vernon Dahmer family, what a great country this would be. They're just incredible family, no bitterness, certainly have a right to be bitter, but not bitter. And to fast forward now, Sam Bowers finally went on trial in 1998, and he was convicted. And when the conviction came in, I was sitting by Vernon Damer Jr., and here was this Air Force veteran. And when the verdict came in, I'll get choked up talking about it. He just had his hands over his face, and the tears were coming out between his fingers. And he finally had time to cry. And that, to me, is what these stories are about, to tell these families, the courage of these families, because they could have easily, in terms of reopening these cases, could have easily said, no, this is too uncomfortable. We've been through too much trauma. We don't want to go through this again, and just have a jury tell us, not guilty or not decide on it. So I've been inspired by them. So I think I want to recognize them and honor them for what they've done.
For me, it was yes, it was a choice. I decided pretty early in this version of this project, it's lived in multiple forms, but in this version of this project, that I would write as much as I could in what's called close shifting third, so that my readers were seeing the world through the eyes of the people who lived it. And I did it that way because we have a feeling in much of America today that change happens when the president makes a change, or when Congress makes a change, or when someone with great persuasive powers of speaking makes a pivotal speech. We say we had civil rights because Martin Luther King Jr. And the reality is we get change when ordinary Americans say what is happening on my corner of the world is wrong, and it will not be that way anymore. We don't make change at a national level. We make change on our very own street corner. And these were ordinary kids. They were 14, 15, 16 years old. They wanted to go to prom. They wanted to go to football games. They agreed to go along with this because they were being shipped to another county where they were too far away to go to prom and to go to football games. That's what their big dreams were. And their very radical action is that every single day they get up and they go to school. And that should be the most ordinary thing in the world. But they ended up making American history by getting up and going to school. And we need a real reminder of that in our nation today. First of all, that we can make change. And second of all, if we don't make change, it is our fault, not the fault of our president, not the fault of our Congress. It sits with us. And it's about time we start taking that more seriously. And it is also, as the adults in the room, about time we say it's our problem, not our children's problem as well.
We'll talk about the title of your book, because I think it hints at a paradox that makes it hard for people to make change, because how the people of Clinton saw themselves versus the reality of what they were doing to these kids was very stark. And the same in Mississippi when you interviewed some, people who were in the Klan. How they saw themselves and what they were doing was very righteous and very religious and very Christian, but the reality was different. So how did that shift happen, and how can we as a society, battle against that?
Yeah, so the title of my town is actually from a quote given to me by one of the 12 Black students. Her name is Joanne Allen Boyce. She's actually written her own account of the desegregation of Clinton High School, and it is perfect for middle grade students. So if you have a kid in your life who's like 4th to 6th grade, please go buy Miss Boyce's book. It's fantastic. But I was talking to Miss Boyce about what had happened and what they had expected. And again, they're the first, so they don't know that there's going to be violence when they begin this. And she said, we had hope. Clinton was a most tolerant little town. And when she first said that to me, and actually when we chose it for the title originally, I took that as I'm a good millennial. I like something that is a little bit ironic, right? I embrace this. And as I've lived with the title, I've realized it's absolutely true. We tolerate a headache until we take ibuprofen. We tolerate an itch until we scratch it. We tolerate a coworker who annoys us until we yell at them. Clinton was tolerant. It was not equal. It had none of the white people in town had any intention for it to be a site of equality. Clinton was not a space that intended to set history in this way, at least not on the white side of things. The best any white person was willing to give these kids was tolerance. And when they stepped past what was tolerated, they received very little protection from any white person in town who had power to, in fact, protect them. There were a couple of exceptions that are notable. They are exceptions. Mm-hmm. There are two. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, interviewing the Klansmen, obviously, I got quite different view of of this situation. But I did interview all of them. Bowers, I didn't really get a sit-down interview. I talked to him briefly one time, but by phone. But yeah, they thought they were doing the right thing. I mean, Byron D. Lebeckwith, when I sat down with him, again, the man who assassinated Medgar Evers, I went and interviewed him. He lived in Signal Mountain, Tennessee. Absolutely the most racist person I ever spent serious time with. Just N-word this, N-word that, and then started on other non-white races. He, you know how sometimes after you talk to someone, you feel like maybe you need a bath afterwards. Yeah, that's kind of how it felt. And but he's a part of what's called Christian identity. And forgive me, I'm going to tell it bluntly, and therefore it sounds horribly racist, but that really is horribly racist, so you'll understand. So what Christian identity believes, very quickly, is that Adam and Eve were white people, that all the non-white races were made on the sixth day with the animals and therefore have no souls. And they believe that that Eve had sex with Satan, the serpent, and this is where Jews came from. So it's very incredibly anti-Semitic, incredibly racist religion. But this is what he believed, and he told me all about it. He was happy to tell me all about it, you know, when I started asking him questions about it. So these people felt like, you know, they were on God's side. I mean, that's the Klan did, and with what they did in Mississippi throughout that period of time. And, you know, it is kind of ironic, you know. I am a Christian and a person of faith, and I'm appalled by all this. So it's just interesting how people justify their evil acts, but it's nothing new in a sense, you know.
But you also talk about there was opportunity for redemption for at least one Klansman. Yeah,
I talked about in the Vernon Dahmer case, the guy who was the key witness, a guy whose name was Billy Roy Pitts. He was involved in the killing of Vernon Dahmer, dropped his gun, got caught, pleaded guilty to murder, got a life sentence for that, pleaded guilty to a federal charge, got 5 years for that. And long story short, basically I figured out he'd never done any of his state time, so he got arrested. Anyway, have the trial, everything. I'm skipping a lot, but after Bowers is convicted, Billy Roy Pitts testified in a hearing, and when he got done, he walked to the back of the courtroom. And when he got there, he ran into Ellie Dahmer, the widow of Vernon Dahmer, and he apologized to Mrs. Dahmer and asked her to forgive him for killing her husband. And she forgave him. And she began to cry. And the Dahmer children who were there began to cry. He began to cry. And really that's what redemption's all about, isn't it? Trying to make things right after they've gone so terribly wrong. But incredible moment to have witnessed that. You know?
For the kids in Clinton, there were some that had long-term trauma
Yes.
from what they went through.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about some of the scars that didn't heal from what they experienced.
You know, one of the reasons most of you have probably never heard of Clinton, Tennessee, is that after this experience reached a new stage, I don't know that we can say it's over because America's schools are more segregated today than they were in 1968. But when they reached a new stage, most of the Black students simply stopped talking about it. In some cases, they did not tell their spouses what had happened. They did not tell their children what had happened. They did not talk about it. And there are several reasons for that. Some of it was there was silence across the entire community after the high school was bombed. It was a way of creating détente instead of fighting for peace. It's a tiny town. You can't shop at different grocery stores. Everybody has to go to the same food city. And so you had to go to the post office and see the person who had been on the other side of the picket line from you. And so they chose silence. But in the case of the Black students, they also chose silence because they had PTSD. And several of them have spoken about this. The first student to graduate from Clinton High School on the 3rd anniversary of the Brown versus Board decision, Bobby Kane, he, about 2 weeks into this experience, was interviewed by a war correspondent. And this correspondent said, the symptoms that this child are exhibiting are symptoms I have only seen in men who have shell shock. He begins to sweat. He stumbles over his words. His eyes go distant. He drifts off. He is undergoing things that he cannot process and he cannot accept. And that was before the Tennessee White Youth was organized. That was before the bombing started on the Hill. That was before things got worse in Clinton. And a lot of the students talk about how their trauma during that year prevented them from learning, which is something we know now. When you are in the middle of a traumatic situation, especially when your brain is still that young and still that malleable, it goes to survival. And survival is not learning calculus. So you no longer absorb new information. You can sit in your English class, but you can't remember anything from Shakespeare. And so their grades all suffer. There's one young woman who actually fails a class at Clinton and goes on to get an A in it when she gets to college. Because when she was there, she could not remember it. And that trauma, as we now know from soldiers who have come back from combat, that is long-term experiences that alter a person's entire life. It alters their families. It changes their children's experiences. It is something that we really need to wrestle with as one of the aspects of what we have done as a society.
And looking forward, I mean, I just would love to hear your perspective in the time that we're in now, where there seems to be a flirtation with autocracy and limiting freedoms. How would you, what warning would you give to people who are sort of flirting with this idea about how hard it is in those types of situations to stand up and be brave? I know, Jerry, you received from your reporting lots of death threats. Just talk about a little bit about what that kind of society means in reality.
Well, I'm no expert on autocracy, but I think one of the issues that's kind of floating around in this situation is this idea that we don't have to teach history, or certain history to our kids because it makes them uncomfortable. And Myrlie Evers said it best. She said, we keep repeating this history because we don't know our history. And I know a number of people and you've probably had the same experience. A number of people who've read my book, I've gotten like emails from or calls from, and they said, I had no idea this happened. You know, they didn't know their own history, you know, even though they were from Mississippi or from the South. And it just kind of baffles me, you know, because this idea of willful ignorance, if you want, you know, really is what it is we really don't want to know that. And when we do that, when we want to create our own truth, so to speak, instead of relying on what is true, then I think we're headed to danger. When truth doesn't mean anything anymore, we're headed for dangerous place, because, like, thinking in terms of these cases, you have to have truth in order to have justice. And that's why truth is so important. We rely on it for so many things in our democracy. And if truth doesn't matter anymore, then we are open to, you know, authoritarian or autocracy or whatever. You know, it opens us up for that because we don't know what's true anymore. It's just whatever this particular person maybe tells us is true.
Willful ignorance is the very definition of white privilege. My TikTok feed has been full, well, first of all, about the ban on TikTok, which whatever, but also, and what is happening in Palestine. But the other thing that has taken it over lately is the Love is Blind brouhaha. Never seen it, but apparently I might need to watch the reunion episode, because there is this moment in which one of the white female contestants is joking with one of the white male contestants about him groping a black female contestant. And apparently on this reunion episode, when they're called out about it and told, this is racist, this has its roots in what has been done to black women for generations, her response, the white woman's response, was, oh, I didn't know.
Wow.
I don't think I'm allowed to cuss on this right now, but you know what I'm thinking. Thank you. Would you like to cuss for me right now? But when we enable that ignorance in white people, because the black woman on that show knew. She went into that aware. She had no doubt of what that history was. When we refused to talk about the violence that met these school children who were attempting to go to school, when we washed that, literally whitewashed that out of history, black children still have to know that. Black children still have to be aware of that. We're giving our white kids the protection of perpetuating that hate and then saying, oh, I didn't know. We're giving our white girls the protection of when they get called out on something like that. It's such new information that they can just weep beautifully and delicately and get even more protection. It's good to cry. We should be crying over this. We should do it privately. We should do it to ourselves. Public weeping is a different exercise or exorcise of our history. And it is time we go about protecting all children, not just little white ones.
Well, we're going to open it up to questions. We have 2 microphones here in the front, so if any of you have a question, please step up to the microphone and we'll be glad to hear you.
I have a question about the writing process, and especially Jerry. I've been told that literary nonfiction, memoir, is true-ish.
True-ish.
When it comes to creating scenes, to creating
Right.
dialogue. You and I come from a background where there is no such thing.
No
as
such thing, right.
true-ish. How do you reconcile the creating of the scene, the creating of dialogues, and with your journalism background?
Right. Well,
I
go ahead.
think the microphone wasn't working, so
Oh, okay.
I'll just kind of summarize the question. How do you reconcile the process of writing with your journalistic work?
I mean, pretty simply, I kept a journal the whole time, Phil, and the whole time I was keeping my notes, all my and typically what I was doing is recreating as I went along, if that makes any sense. Like if I had a scene with, meeting with the Attorney General, I would go ahead and transform that and have that. In fact, funny side story on that. I did it. I showed it back to people who were there, and showed it back to them, and one of them was like, I don't even remember being at this meeting, and so I sent more of my notes. Here are my notes from all this time, and there he goes. Oh yeah, I guess I was there. Yeah.
I'm sorry I came in a little bit late. Had a hard time finding it. Did you speak about McDonald 19 and Leona Tate, Tessie, and Gail Prevost? And November 14th, 1960, they desegregated our school along with Ruby Bridges. Did you have a chance to talk about them before?
I did not speak about them
Okay.
before.
Well, I'm going to give you a brochure. I'm on the board of that
good, yeah.
center.
Yeah.
And so, and this is my card. I'm on a board. I'm not selling you anything. I promise I'm retired. Thank God. But yes, so I'm going to give
cool.
you each. And please come to our center. Leona Tate, who is one of those 3 little 6-year-olds,
Yeah.
we're dear friends and we're the same age. And I can tell you my experience going into school was not our Leona Tate's experience and Tessie and Gail. So I wanted to give you this just in case you didn't mention it when I came in 10 minutes late. I apologize. But they desegregated the school
Right
in
here.
lower 9 the same day Ruby Bridges, but they didn't get out in front as fast as Ruby Bridges did.
Right.
And just for people who may not know this, Norman Rockwell's picture on the magazine is a model. It is not Ruby Bridges. So he tries, his family keeps that message. But please come visit our center, which is in lower 9, which opened a couple of years ago. Here you go.
Thank
I'd
you.
love to.
Yes, thank you.
Please.
We were.
Thank you.
And those are the 3 girls who desegregated November 14, 1960.
Yes. I was aware of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
We were talking about it before.
We
the
were,
panel.
yes.
Go ahead.
Hi, Jerry.
Hi.
I met you a couple years ago on the TAMUC Civil Rights Trip
That's
to
right.
Mississippi.
Very good.
I got your book, Race Against Time, and it's since become one of my favorites, so it's really
Thank
great
you.
to see you again. I was wondering if you could both talk about redemption in the sense of kind of today's aggressions, things that are less murder and more like the
Right.
love is blind situation, and how redemption can be earned for things that are really, really harmful.
Go ahead.
Yeah. First, we have to believe that people can change.
Exactly.
And thank God there are examples in history that show people can change. Now, you had dramatic change. I didn't have anybody who changed dramatically. I had a lot of people who still thought exactly what they thought in 1956, which was,
But you talk about
Appalling,
the rule of law segregationists.
yes, and there were people like Margaret Anderson, the white teacher I mentioned at the beginning, who were in close contact with the Black students, who were hearing their stories, who were seeing what this meant in their lives. And that listening, which is the key to this, that listening began to change her. And it was a multi-year process. The white principal of the high school went through a very similar process. One thing that I think we underestimate is the importance of putting our bodies where we want our brains to go. We do a lot of study these days. We love a good, especially in this room, I imagine we all love a good book group. Definitely read, especially my book. You should all read my book. Yeah, there we go. It's a great cover, isn't it? But you do not change yourself until you change your actions.
Right.
And your brain follows your body. And so I think one thing we need to begin doing is figuring out how to create spaces for people who want to be among us, who are not yet ready, where their bodies can be there before their brains are, and yet the people who are still vulnerable are protected from what damage they might do. And so in a situation like the Love is Blind, eventually that young white woman needs to have a conversation with the young black woman. Eventually she needs to hear what that meant. She can't hear that from her right now, not safely for the woman in question, right? So it needs to be a multi-stage process, but when somebody stumbles, when somebody fails, we can't immediately reject them and say there's no hope for you. Instead, we have to say, oh, you weren't ready for that step. Let's go back a step. Let's begin again. Redemption is possible. Change is possible. The one thing I'm struggling with right now, though, when it comes to redemption is whether those of us, and of course we're talking about race here right now, but in any of these issues, whether those of us who have done harm have the right to ask for forgiveness. I think we must say we are sorry. But do we get to demand forgiveness? I don't think we do. I don't think we do. I think we get to pray or hope or whatever your chosen belief system is, that it will be offered to you. But when you do damage, I think what you do is you make penance.
Yes.
You make change. You work to fix the harm you have done and prevent it from happening to other people.
Yeah.
I don't know that you get to say, individually, you must make me feel better. That's very selfish.
Well, I think it's part of this process, which is making amends. Essentially, you're going to make amends. If you've harmed someone, you should be trying to make amends. And I think you're right. Forgiveness, whether it's bestowed or not, is, you shouldn't demand it. I think that's well, you should just forgive me. I know sometimes people say, well, you're kind of getting the cart before the horse here. You should be trying to make things right before you demand forgiveness.
And these conversations, that need to be had, I think, these books are a great start in in having these conversations. And I'll hold up your steel.
Yeah, hold mine. There you go.
Right.
Also a good cover.
Thank you.
Because I think the way the writing is, it comes from a place of laying out the story as it happened, as it was real. It doesn't come from a place of advocacy or these people are right or wrong. It really comes from, your ability to tell the story of real humans trying to make some kind of change. So, I really appreciated reading that and thanking you for that. Any other questions from the audience?
I do think, both these books are books that can be used in classrooms and things like that. I know mine's been used, just excerpts of it and things like that, because it's not intimidating. It's not intimidating, in terms of just taking that material and learning from it. And I think it's so valuable that we growing up, and I'm sure those of you who are my age or older know I'm telling the truth. We didn't learn any of this history. This was not taught in schools, and still, unfortunately, not taught in some schools. So we owe it to ourselves to know this history so that we, as Merle ever said, we don't repeat our history.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you both. This has been really enlightening.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.